What if you found out that your father, the man you trusted, had fathered your children? How far would betrayal push you, and what happens when anger and shame go too far? In today's case, Daniel Carter, a Texas preacher, discovers a devastating truth about his family that spirals into a tragic and deadly conclusion. Stay with us as we unfold this shocking story. In a quiet Texas town, nestled between sprawling farmlands and small-town churches, Daniel Carter, a well-respected preacher, saw his life unravel in a way that no one could have ever predicted. A respected figure in his community, loved for his faith and guidance, Daniel had built a life centered around his family. But that life was shattered when a routine DNA test, something meant to be nothing more than a health precaution, revealed a devastating truth. A truth so painful, so unimaginable, that it would alter the course of his life forever. The results of that DNA test unveiled a betrayal that no man could prepare for. His father, John Carter, the one man he trusted above all, had fathered his children. Daniel, already struggling with years of emotional tension in his marriage to Rachel, suddenly found himself thrust into a nightmarish reality. The relationship he had with his wife, his children, and his father, everything he knew to be true, was a lie. What followed was not a quiet resignation or acceptance. Instead, a violent outburst that no one saw coming. A single revelation that sent shockwaves through his family, leading to a brutal act of violence. Daniel's world, once filled with faith and guidance, was consumed by a toxic blend of shame, anger, and betrayal. And in the end, it would lead to a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. This is a story of secrets, deep, dark secrets that were hidden for far too long. It's a tale of betrayal, where trust is shattered beyond repair, and a man, once grounded in his faith, is pushed to the brink of madness. A man who, despite his years of dedication to his community, could not escape the emotional toll of deception. His world, once built on love, devotion, and trust, was ripped apart in an instant. This is also a story of how the human psyche can break under the weight of unbearable truths. A man who once held his head high in the pulpit, now found himself in a battle with his own emotions, unable to reconcile his faith with the agony of the betrayal he had suffered. His response? A violent act that would destroy everything he once held dear. What started as a painful revelation spiraled into something far darker, something that no one could have ever predicted. A brutal killing, a senseless, heartbreaking act of rage, that would forever change the lives of Daniel, Rachel, and the entire community. This is the story of how a single revelation led to the unimaginable, an act of violence that no one could have seen coming. Stay with us as we explore the depths of betrayal, the destructive consequences of unchecked emotion, and the tragic events that unfolded from a family secret. This is a story that will make you question the limits of trust, the human capacity for violence, and how far anger and shame can push a person before they break. Daniel Carter was a well-known and highly respected figure in his community, a man whose life seemed as flawless as the sermons he delivered every Sunday. To the outside world, he was everything one might hope for in a preacher, compassionate, dedicated, and unwavering in his faith. A devout man of God, he spent his days tending to the needs of his congregation, offering guidance and comfort to those in need, always the voice of reason in troubled times. His words were powerful, his presence commanding. People looked to him not only for spiritual guidance but also for moral clarity. At home, Daniel presented the image of a loving husband and father. He and his wife, Rachel Carter, were the picture of marital bliss. Together, they raised 3 children, all of whom were described as well-behaved and respectful. They lived in a quiet, picturesque house, surrounded by the comforts of suburban life. On the outside, their family was an example of what many people aspire to have: a happy home, a stable marriage, and a strong, God-fearing family unit. But behind closed doors, the reality was far different. The perfect family life that everyone believed in was a facade, one that concealed years of emotional turmoil, trust issues, and, ultimately, betrayal. Raised in a deeply religious family, Daniel was always taught to value family above all else. From a young age, he was taught that loyalty, faith, and family were sacred, and he carried these principles with him as he grew older. He married his high school sweetheart, Rachel, and they quickly became a well-known couple in their community. Together, they were seen as the epitome of family values. However, as time passed, cracks began to form in the seemingly perfect marriage. There were whispered tensions between them, though no one outside their immediate circle could quite put their finger on it. Rachel had always been supportive of Daniel's work in the church, but she, too, had her own struggles. Daniel had little knowledge of the internal battles she faced, nor the guilt and secrets she kept buried deep within her. Though they seemed to be the perfect couple, their relationship was far from perfect. It was a marriage built on the surface of faith and appearances, but underneath, there were secrets that would eventually unravel in the most devastating way possible. For years, Daniel was the cornerstone of his church. His sermons were known for being powerful, filled with passion and wisdom that resonated with his congregation. People relied on him for guidance, and many sought solace in the church's strong, supportive community. He was seen as a beacon of light in a town that valued tradition, faith, and family. But what many didn't know was that behind the pulpit, Daniel struggled with a side of himself that was hidden from public view. Despite the outward calm and confidence he portrayed, the pressures of his role weighed heavily on him. The responsibility of guiding his flock, leading the church, and maintaining the image of a perfect family left him feeling isolated, conflicted, and, at times, deeply resentful. The role of preacher had its own set of burdens, and while he thrived in his public duties, his personal life was plagued with tension. There were moments of silence at home, moments when his wife would retreat emotionally, and moments when he questioned whether he could continue living the life he had built. Though he was the moral authority for so many, within his own home, the foundations of his life were starting to crumble. It all started when Daniel decided to take a routine DNA test. The test was intended to be nothing more than a health precaution, a simple way to learn more about his genetics and potential health risks. It was a decision that seemed harmless at the time, but it would soon set off a chain of events that would unravel his entire world. When the results of the DNA test came back, they were beyond anything Daniel could have prepared for. The findings weren't just a minor surprise. They were the kind of revelation that can tear apart lives, families, and identities. The results showed that his 3 children, the children he had raised as his own and loved deeply, were not biologically his. They were linked to someone else, someone he never could have imagined. In that moment, the foundation of everything Daniel thought he knew about his family began to crack. The perfect life, the loving relationship with Rachel, and his identity as a father, all of it now seemed like a lie. The DNA test had unveiled a truth so devastating, so painful, that it felt impossible to accept. His children, the ones he had raised and cared for, were not his blood. But the shock didn't end there. The results went even further, revealing something far more inconceivable than he could have imagined. The true father of his children was not some distant figure, not even a stranger, but the man he had trusted most in the world. The man who had shaped his life, his values, and his very sense of self. The DNA test showed that his own father, John Carter, was the biological father of his 3 children. The betrayal was beyond comprehension. How could this have happened? How could the man who had raised him, the man he had looked up to his entire life, have committed such an unspeakable betrayal? Not only had his father broken the most sacred trust, but he had also violated the very essence of family itself. But it wasn't just the shock of the revelation that cut deepest, it was the emotional and moral destruction it left in its wake. How could Rachel, the woman he had shared his life with, the mother of his children, have kept such a devastating secret? How could she have allowed him to raise children that were not biologically his, knowing the truth all along? The preacher had always believed in the sanctity of family, the trust that should exist within a marriage, but now, it seemed that everything he had held dear was a lie. The foundation of his relationship with his wife, the life they had built together, was built on a lie of the most intimate kind. When Daniel first discovered the truth, the emotional weight was unbearable. It was as though the world had tilted off its axis, and the very foundation of his life had crumbled. The discovery of the DNA results hit him like a sledgehammer. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build a life based on faith, trust, and family. But in a moment, it was all destroyed. The man he had looked up to, the man he had trusted as his father, had destroyed his entire family with a betrayal so deep that it seemed impossible to comprehend. His mind raced with thoughts of anger and confusion. How could his father, his mentor, his moral compass, have done something so vile? And worse, how could his wife, Rachel, the woman he had spent years with, keep such a secret from him for all those years? Every interaction with her suddenly seemed tainted by the revelation. The silence she had maintained throughout this entire ordeal spoke volumes. She had known, and she had allowed him to live a lie. This wasn't just a betrayal of his trust, it was the destruction of everything he had believed in. But the hardest part of all was what came next, confronting Rachel. When Daniel finally confronted Rachel, the pain in his voice was evident, and the anger was palpable. He demanded answers, but the woman he thought he knew so well remained quiet for a long moment, as though lost in the weight of the secret she had carried for so long. When she spoke, her voice was filled with guilt and regret. Rachel didn't deny the affair. She didn't try to sugarcoat the truth or make excuses. She admitted to everything. The betrayal had been painful for her too, she explained, but she spoke of the close relationship she had with John, Daniel's father. A relationship that had crossed boundaries, an emotional bond that had turned into something far more complicated and intimate. She admitted the affair had happened long ago, but she insisted it was a mistake, something that had spiraled out of control. Her justification did little to ease the pain for Daniel. The man he had trusted most had violated the sanctity of his marriage. His father, who had been a guiding figure in his life, a person he had revered, had crossed the ultimate line. And Rachel, the person he had chosen to share his life with, had kept this secret from him for years. The preacher's emotions were no longer just anger. His heart was torn between humiliation and rage. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he had ever experienced. His trust had been shattered, and every aspect of his life seemed to be a lie. He had loved his children as his own, and now he knew the truth, that they were not his, but his father's. The realization that everything he had believed to be true was a farce tore at the very core of his being. The emotional toll on Daniel was unbearable. As the days passed, he became more and more erratic. His mind, once filled with devotion and clarity, was now clouded by rage and confusion. He could no longer trust anyone, not Rachel, who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, not John, who had shattered his entire sense of identity, and not even his own children, who were now a painful reminder of the deception. Daniel began to withdraw from the world around him. His once confident demeanor was replaced with a man trapped in a whirlwind of doubt and anger. His once strong faith was now a fragile thing, easily consumed by his growing paranoia. How could he continue preaching to his congregation about trust, loyalty, and faith when his entire life had been a lie? Thoughts of vengeance and retribution clouded his every moment. The man who had spent years preaching peace and love now found himself consumed by the need to make those who had wronged him suffer. The anger boiled inside him, eating away at his sanity. He couldn't escape the thoughts of his father's betrayal, of Rachel's silence, of the destruction of his perfect family. It was all too much. His emotions were a storm, a hurricane of confusion, pain, and anger. His life was falling apart, piece by piece. Daniel found himself unable to sleep, unable to focus, unable to find peace in the very things that once gave him solace. The once revered preacher, a man of faith and a pillar in his community, was now a shell of the person he had once been. His mind was consumed by one thought: how could this happen? How could his world have turned upside down so quickly, and where would he go from here? As the days dragged on, the walls of paranoia closed in around him. Every glance from Rachel seemed to hold judgment. Every word spoken to him by his children seemed like a painful reminder of the betrayal. He couldn't trust anyone, and the emotional turmoil consumed him. Daniel was on the edge, his mind teetering between sanity and madness. The days following the discovery of the truth were nothing short of tormenting for Daniel. What had once been a home full of love and faith had become a battleground, with every room in the house filled with unspoken words, resentment, and unbearable tension. Daniel's relationship with Rachel deteriorated rapidly. The small moments of normalcy they had once shared, meals, conversations, prayers, were now lost in a haze of bitterness and betrayal. Daniel could no longer look at Rachel without feeling the weight of the lies she had kept from him. The emotional toll of knowing that his father had fathered his children, coupled with the fact that Rachel had kept such a secret, was a burden that he could no longer carry. He became increasingly withdrawn, his eyes hollow, his once confident presence replaced with an air of volatile tension. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison to him. Each passing day pushed him further to the edge, the emotional weight pulling him into a spiral of rage and despair. As the days turned into weeks, the relationship with his children became strained. Daniel, unable to look at them without the bitterness of betrayal clouding his vision, began to retreat further into himself. He was becoming someone unrecognizable to his own family. Then, on one fateful night, when everything came crashing down, the unthinkable happened. In a moment of rage and despair, Daniel snapped. The events that led to that night had been building up for far too long. The preacher's emotional state was at its breaking point. His anger had festered, and with each passing day, the pressure grew. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The truth was out, and it was eating him alive. The details of that night are chilling. It started like any other argument they had been having for days, Daniel demanding answers, Rachel trying to explain. Words were exchanged, but this time, something was different. Daniel's anger, already simmering beneath the surface, boiled over. He could no longer contain it. As Rachel tried once again to explain her actions, pleading with him to understand her side, Daniel's emotions overtook him in a way that no one could have predicted. His voice, once calm and authoritative, was now a shout, laced with years of pain, betrayal, and humiliation. In his mind, everything was crashing down. The anger that had been building up for so long finally found its outlet, and in that moment, there was no turning back. His mind was clouded by rage, and every word she spoke only fueled the fire. The confrontation quickly escalated, and what started as an argument over the affair turned into a violent fight. Daniel, consumed by his emotions, attacked Rachel in a blind rage. His hands, once used to offer comfort and guidance, were now a weapon. It happened so quickly, too quickly for anyone to intervene. The force of his actions left Rachel lifeless on the floor. The woman who had once been his partner, the mother of his children, lay in a pool of blood, and Daniel stood there, frozen in disbelief at the devastation he had caused. What followed was a nightmare that no one could have predicted. His anger, which had once been a flicker, had now turned into an uncontrollable blaze, and it had consumed everything in its path. The once strong preacher, a man who had spent his life preaching peace and love, was now a killer. By the time authorities arrived, it was already too late. Daniel had fled the scene, leaving behind the woman he had once vowed to protect, her body cold and motionless in the home they had shared. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no time to think, no time to process what had just happened. His world had shattered beyond recognition, and in a moment of blind rage, he had taken everything he held dear with him. The community that once revered Daniel was now left in shock and disbelief. News of the murder spread quickly, and the small Texas town was rocked to its core. Daniel, once a man of faith and guidance, was now the center of a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The family, the church, and the entire town had been torn apart by an act of violence that seemed so out of character for the man they thought they knew. As the investigation began, questions swirled around Daniel's motives, the underlying tensions in his family, and the emotional devastation that had led to such a senseless act. But no answers would come easily. Daniel was now a fugitive, on the run, and his fate was uncertain. The world he had once known. The church, the community, the family, was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of prison walls. The town that once saw him as a beacon of light was now left to grapple with the horrifying truth. How could a man, once trusted and admired, have descended into such darkness? What drove him to kill the woman he had loved? And what would become of the family left in the wake of this tragedy? Daniel's life, and the lives of those around him, would never be the same again. What began as a simple DNA test had led to a devastating and irreversible consequence. The preacher's story had come to a tragic and violent end. Local law enforcement responded swiftly to the horrific scene that unfolded in Daniel Carter's home. The 911 call came in around midnight, reporting loud screams coming from the preacher's residence. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, immediately called the authorities, but no one could have predicted the devastating truth that would soon be revealed behind those closed doors. When the police arrived, they were met with an unsettling silence. The sounds of a family, once warm with love and trust, had been replaced with the echoes of violence. Inside the house, officers found Rachel Carter's lifeless body, lying in a pool of blood. The room was in disarray, signs of a violent struggle scattered across the floor. It was immediately clear that what had started as a domestic argument had escalated into something far more deadly. But there was no sign of Daniel. The house was empty, except for the tragic aftermath. Officers began searching the premises for any clues, footprints, fingerprints, anything that could lead them to the suspect, but Daniel had already disappeared, leaving behind only a chilling crime scene. The investigation began immediately. It quickly became evident that the preacher was the prime suspect. Theories emerged, with many speculating that Daniel's emotional turmoil, stemming from the shocking DNA test results and the betrayal by his wife and father, had pushed him to this point. The authorities scoured the area, asking neighbors and searching for any witnesses who may have seen anything suspicious. As the investigators delved deeper into the background of Daniel and his troubled marriage to Rachel, they began piecing together a story of emotional strain, dishonesty, and betrayal. It was clear that this wasn't a crime of opportunity or an isolated act of anger, it was the culmination of years of hidden pain. The authorities wasted no time in issuing an arrest warrant for Daniel, and a full-scale manhunt began. Law enforcement agents began tracking down every lead, reaching out to Daniel's contacts, searching local towns, and scouring every possible hiding spot he could have used. The search was urgent. The longer Daniel remained at large, the more questions remained unanswered. It wasn't long before rumors began circulating within the town. Some believed that Daniel had gone to ground in a neighboring town, trying to lay low and escape the consequences of his actions. Others feared that he might have fled the state entirely, disappearing into the vast unknown. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's face was plastered across every news outlet and newspaper. He was no longer just a preacher, he was a fugitive. The man who had once been a beacon of faith and guidance was now being hunted down for a heinous crime that seemed out of character for the man people once knew and trusted. The community, once tightly knit, was now divided. While some held out hope that Daniel could be found and brought to justice, others were left grappling with the painful truth: a man they had revered for years had been hiding a violent side that no one could have foreseen. As the manhunt continued, the tension in the community grew. People whispered about Daniel's mental state in the days leading up to the crime. Was the emotional pressure of his family's betrayal too much for him to handle? Was he a man who had snapped under the weight of betrayal and lost his sanity? Or was he, in fact, a cold-blooded killer who had long harbored violent tendencies? Families who had once sought solace in the church, in Daniel's sermons, now found themselves questioning everything. Could they trust their preacher? Could they trust anyone? How had someone so loved, so respected, become capable of such violence? With every passing day, the authorities felt more pressure to capture Daniel. The community grew anxious, as the search for the preacher intensified. It became more than just a search for justice, it became a search for understanding. How could a man of faith, a man who had preached peace and love for so many years, commit such a heinous crime? The questions haunted everyone, from law enforcement to those who once considered Daniel a friend and mentor. The longer Daniel remained at large, the more the community's collective trust eroded. The man they had all trusted was now a fugitive, and the town was forced to come to terms with the fact that they had been blind to the dark side of a man they once admired. It wasn't long before the authorities finally tracked Daniel down. After days of searching, he was found hiding in a small town several hours away from his own, trying to lay low and escape the consequences of his actions. Daniel had managed to evade capture for days, but the authorities weren't about to let him slip away again. The arrest took place in the early hours of the morning, as law enforcement surrounded the modest house where Daniel had been staying. Daniel, weary from days of hiding and realizing there was no escape, surrendered without resistance. There was no dramatic chase, no gunfire, just the quiet acknowledgement that his time had run out. The man who had once stood at the pulpit, offering wisdom and guidance to his congregation, was now a prisoner, facing the consequences of his actions. When Daniel was brought back to town, the shock in the community was palpable. The man they had once admired, a man who had shaped their lives and their faith, was now a criminal, convicted of a senseless and brutal act. The pristine image of Daniel Carter had been shattered, and in its place stood a man who would be remembered for the violence he had brought into his own home. The trial was nothing short of dramatic. The courtroom became the stage for a fierce battle between the prosecution and the defense. Daniel's defense team tried to argue that his actions had been driven by extreme emotional distress. They painted a picture of a man pushed to his breaking point, a man who had been betrayed by both his father and his wife, his trust shattered, his faith in the world around him destroyed. His actions, they claimed, were the result of madness, an uncontrollable outburst driven by the emotional weight of years of betrayal. However, the prosecution painted Daniel as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had chosen to murder Rachel in a fit of rage and jealousy. The fact that Daniel had been a preacher, someone trusted by so many, made his crime all the more heinous in the eyes of the prosecution. They argued that no matter the emotional distress he had suffered, there was no justification for taking a life, especially that of his wife, a woman who had once been his partner in faith. The victim's family expressed their anger and grief over the loss of Rachel. The prosecutor referred to the crime as senseless, a result of a man who had allowed his emotions to consume him and destroy everything he had once held dear. As the trial unfolded, the public was divided. Some sympathized with Daniel, seeing him as a tragic figure, a man driven to madness by the years of betrayal and emotional distress. Others viewed him as a cold, calculating murderer who had let his anger and rage define his actions. The community's reactions ranged from deep sympathy to outright condemnation. The question that lingered in everyone's mind was, how could someone who had preached forgiveness, someone who had been trusted to lead others in faith, commit such an unforgivable crime? The trial exposed the complexity of human emotions and the lengths to which pain and betrayal could drive a person. The once revered preacher had become a symbol of brokenness and the destructive potential of unchecked emotions. After weeks of intense testimony, the jury finally deliberated and returned with a verdict: Daniel Carter was convicted of second-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the judge read the verdict. For Daniel, the man who had once stood at the pulpit with so much reverence and respect, the reality of his actions had now been sealed in the eyes of the law. The man who had once been a beacon of hope and faith was now a convicted killer. The families present in the courtroom, including Rachel's family, had mixed emotions. The victim's family expressed a sense of relief that justice had been served, but that relief was tempered by the heartbreak of knowing that nothing could bring Rachel back. For them, the conviction brought an end to a painful chapter, but it would never undo the devastating loss. Daniel, sitting in the defendant's chair, showed no visible reaction to the verdict. His once confident and charismatic demeanor was gone, replaced by a man who had been broken by the weight of his own actions. His faith, his family, and his reputation, all had been destroyed. The once admired preacher was now a convicted murderer, condemned for an act of violence that no one could have anticipated. The public's reaction to the verdict was divided. Some saw Daniel as a tragic figure, a man whose life had unraveled due to the intense emotional turmoil of betrayal. They sympathized with him, believing that his actions were the result of years of deception and a series of events that had pushed him beyond his breaking point. These supporters saw Daniel as a victim of circumstance, a man who had suffered too much and, in a moment of emotional devastation, made an irreversible mistake. On the other side, many viewed Daniel as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had let his anger and betrayal cloud his judgment. They argued that while emotional pain was undeniable, there was no excuse for taking the life of Rachel, a woman he had once loved. The prosecutor's portrayal of the crime as senseless resonated deeply with the community, and many were outraged by Daniel's actions. As news of the conviction spread, some members of the community wrestled with the idea that someone they had trusted for so long, someone who had led them in faith, could commit such a violent crime. The idea that Daniel had become capable of murder was difficult to reconcile with the man they had once known. The once heroic image of the preacher had been replaced by a cold, hard reality that was impossible to ignore. This case isn't just about Daniel Carter, the preacher who snapped. It's about the devastating consequences of betrayal, the emotional scars that it leaves, and how unchecked emotions can lead to irreversible violence. Daniel's story is a tragic example of how deeply betrayal can wound someone, and how dangerous it can be when those emotions are left to fester without resolution. What happens when someone's faith is shattered by the ultimate betrayal? For Daniel, it led to an explosive reaction that no one could have predicted. The emotional weight of discovering that his father had fathered his children, compounded by Rachel's silence, was too much for him to bear. Instead of seeking help or attempting to process his pain in a healthy way, Daniel allowed his anger and feelings of betrayal to spiral out of control. This case reveals the fragility of human emotions and the ways in which we often fail to recognize the destructive power of unchecked rage. Betrayal, while painful, does not justify violence. But in Daniel's case, the emotional and psychological toll of his experiences led to a tragedy that could have been prevented. In moments of deep hurt and betrayal, we must ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go? Can we control our emotions, or do we let them dictate our actions? Daniel Carter's story is a stark reminder that unchecked anger can destroy everything, even a life that once seemed perfect. When our emotions are left to fester and we don't take the necessary steps to heal, the consequences can be catastrophic. Daniel's loss of control and the violence that followed were the result of a breakdown in emotional regulation, a failure to process betrayal in a healthy manner. The tragedy of this case underscores how dangerous it can be to allow unresolved pain to fester in the darkest corners of our hearts. As we reflect on this case, it's important to ask ourselves, what do we do with our emotions when we are hurt? Will we let them control us and lead us to destructive actions, or will we find ways to confront our pain in healthier ways? Daniel Carter's life, once filled with faith and devotion, was destroyed by a moment of rage. His story serves as a painful lesson for us all, showing how easily emotions can push us to the brink. This tragic event is a reminder that no matter how perfect our lives may seem on the outside, we are all vulnerable to the same emotions that drive us toward violence. Let Daniel's story be a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of self-awareness, emotional control, and the willingness to seek help before our pain leads to irreparable consequences. What do you think? Was Daniel Carter justified in his actions, or did he cross a line that should never have been crossed? Can we ever fully understand the emotional toll of betrayal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This case raises questions that are hard to answer, but that's what makes these stories so impactful. Was Daniel a victim of his circumstances, or was he responsible for his own actions? I want to hear your perspective. Was he a man pushed too far, or did he let his emotions take over in the worst possible way? If you're interested in hearing more shocking true crime stories like this one, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. We cover some of the most gripping, heartbreaking, and thought-provoking true crime cases from around the world. Don't miss out on our next deep dive into real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next case we break down. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more. Stay safe, and remember, there's always more to every story than meets the eye.